For decades, I kept silent about what I heard while standing in the shadows behind Vyacheslav Molotov. Spoons clinked against porcelain, glasses tapped softly against crystal, and the most influential people in the country discussed in hushed tones what they were afraid to say aloud: the doctor's case. Today, I will tell you what these feasts looked like from my perspective in the kitchen. Who whispered, who pretended to believe the official reports, and who just pursed their lips and looked away. I will show how the fear of eavesdropping permeated every movement, every pause, and how completely different faces of power were revealed at the Kremlin's ceremonial table. These are not sensational revelations, but the honest account of someone who stood nearby, but slightly to the side. I will share what I remember, and how years later I reinterpreted those evenings when a single word could cost someone their career, their freedom, and sometimes even their life. Who I am, Molotov's chef, and how I got there. Many sincerely believe that the main quality for a chef serving the top brass of the Soviet Union was the ability to masterfully cook hazel grouse or achieve perfect broth clarity. People think that we were selected for our refined taste, culinary intuition, and ability to distinguish saffron from turmeric with our eyes closed. This is a profound misconception that can only arise in someone who has never crossed the threshold of a government residence. Of course, we had to be excellent cooks, but the main ingredient in our work was not salt or pepper, but silence. Absolute, deathly silence, which was valued far more highly than the most exquisite sauce. I did not get into the special kitchen through an advertisement or an acquaintance. At that time, people did not come into our profession. They were taken into it, almost like into the army. In 1947, I worked in the canteen of a closed departmental sanatorium near Moscow, simply doing my job honestly, not stealing food and keeping my mouth shut. Apparently, this is what the people in plain clothes noticed. Then began what we called purgatory. For almost 6 months, I sat without serious work while my biography was sifted through the finest sieve the Ministry of State Security had. They checked everything back to the 7th generation, whether my grandfather was a kulak, whether my wife talked too much in the queue for kerosene, whether my third cousin's uncle had been a prisoner of war in the First World War. If they had found even a speck of dust, even the slightest blemish, I would not be telling you this now, but would have rotted away somewhere in a logging camp. But I turned out to be as clean as a starched tablecloth. The catering service for the top management was cunningly and frighteningly organized. It was not a restaurant, but a restricted facility. Every product had to pass through the laboratory before it could be put in a pot. A toxicologist was always standing next to me in the kitchen. Imagine, you're cutting onions, and behind you stands a man in uniform, making sure you don't add anything extra. The finished dishes were sealed in containers and stamped. We were taught the main rule: you are furniture. You have no ears, no eyes, only hands. If you go into the dining room to change plates, you must become invisible. If you hear a surname, forget it. If you see tears, don't notice them. Lunches at Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Molotov's house were very different from the feasts that Stalin himself organized. At the host's dacha in Blizhnaya, there was, shall we say, controlled chaos. Long nights, Georgian wine, crude jokes, and games of nerves. At Molotov's, everything was different. Here, a prim, almost icy atmosphere reigned. Everyone sat upright and spoke quietly. But the tension at the table was so thick, you could cut it with a knife instead of butter. We felt it most acutely in the kitchen. We were the very place where the pulse of the era was heard. not through microphones, but through uneaten pieces of food and empty glasses. I remember one occasion when a waiter returned a completely untouched roast to the kitchen. Usually, the guests ate heartily, with an appetite typical of people who had been through the war. But here, the plates were full. The waiter, a pale young man, whispered to me, trembling, that there was such a silence in the hall that you could hear the clock ticking on the wall, because someone had carelessly joked about saboteur doctors, and no one had laughed. We immediately understood there would be a storm. Our kitchen staff knew about the coming troubles before they were written about in the newspaper Pravda, simply by the way the guests' hands trembled as they picked up their forks. We understood that proximity to power did not protect us, but only made us a bigger target. To understand our caution, it is enough to look at the historical example of Professor Vladimir Vinogradov, Stalin's personal physician, who treated the leader for years and was almost a member of the family, but in 1952 found himself in chains on suspicion alone, proving that in those corridors, past merits were not worth a penny. We were taught one simple thing, which was hammered into our heads during briefings until it became second nature. You do not exist. We were functional appendages to pots and ladles. We had no opinions, no emotions, not even the right to catch a cold. If you had a runny nose, you were immediately removed and sent to the slop room until you were fully recovered, because infecting a member of the Politburo was a state crime. I remember the winter dinners of 1952 to 1953 in minute detail, because that was when the atmosphere at Molotov's table changed beyond recognition. Before that, they had been tense, but still festive occasions. People discussed 5-year plans, the international situation, and sometimes even joked cautiously. But with the start of the doctor's case, all that disappeared. Conversations became like walking through a minefield. Usually, guests gathered in a small living room adjoining the dining room. There were heavy leather sofas and paintings in massive frames on the walls, mostly landscapes approved by the relevant authorities. No avant-garde, no abstraction. Everything was solid, predictable, like an obituary in a newspaper. A gramophone invariably played in the corner, but the records were not played for pleasure, but for noise. Quiet, unobtrusive classics, Tchaikovsky, Glinka, were supposed to drown out any conversations and create a background that would interfere with the work of listening devices. Everyone knew this, and no one discussed it. The very fact that the gramophone was playing was a silent admission. We are being listened to. Seating at the table was strictly regulated. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich was at the head, with the most honored guest on his right. I remember when Anastas Mikoyan came once. He was always livelier than the others, with a sly squint and quick, sharp eyes. But even he was not himself that evening. He constantly fiddled with his napkin and crumbled bread onto the tablecloth, a sure sign of nervousness. I saw his hands when I served him sturgeon. His fingers, which usually held the fork confidently, trembled slightly. The tension was physically palpable. It hung in the air like the smell of burning. People were afraid to look each other in the eye. Their glances slid over the plates, over the patterns on the wallpaper, over our white jackets. We, the waitstaff, were the perfect object to divert their gaze. You look at the waiter, but in reality, you are thinking about how not to say too much. I often caught these empty, sightless glances. There was no interest in me as a person. I was just a point in space that could be used as a distraction so as not to meet the gaze of the person at the next table. Security guards from the 9th Directorate of the KGB were another integral part of these dinners. They stood at the doors, windows, and behind the curtains. Young men with stony faces, dressed in strict suits. They were taught not only to shoot, but also to listen. Any word uttered at the table could become a line in a report, and the guests understood this perfectly well. Therefore, when someone wanted to say something really important, they did so not with words. It was a language of gestures, understandable only to those in the know. A slightly raised eyebrow, a slight nod towards Stalin's portrait, a meaningful pause after some official phrase. It was a theater in which everyone played their roles, and we, the cooks and waiters, were spectators in the front row, who, however, were strictly forbidden to applaud or even breathe too loudly. For the first time, the doctor's case entered Molotov's house not with a shout, but with the rustle of a newspaper. One morning, at breakfast, Vyacheslav Mikhailovich read Pravda for a long time. At that moment, I brought him freshly brewed tea. He looked up at me heavily from under his glasses and asked, as if addressing the void, "Here they write, 'Murderers in white coats,' and we trusted them." It was not a question that required an answer. It was the articulation of a new reality. From that day on, the topic became the leitmotif of all conversations. At the first big dinner after the article was published, one of the guests, I think it was someone from the Central Committee, began to quote the newspaper's wording with ostentatious indignation. He spoke loudly, almost reciting, looking not at his interlocutors, but somewhere at the ceiling. "Just think," he thundered, "a Zionist conspiracy at the very heart of our medicine. Vile spies, hirelings of American imperialism." The others nodded silently. It was a ritual, a mandatory program. It was necessary to demonstrate loyalty, to show that you fully and unconditionally supported the party line. But behind this facade lay something completely different. I remember how the wife of one of the ministers, a woman who had been treated by Professor Vovsi, one of the main defendants, quietly said to her neighbor, "But he saved my life in 1949. She said it almost silently, with just her lips, but in the ensuing pause, her words sounded like a gunshot. Her neighbor flinched in fear and immediately started talking loudly about the weather, about how snowy this winter was. The topic was instantly buried under a layer of small talk, but everyone sitting nearby heard it. And this brief episode told me more about the real state of affairs than all the front pages of Pravda. People were afraid. They were afraid for themselves, for their families. Many of them had been treated by these killer doctors for years. They had entrusted them with their most intimate secrets, their ailments. And now they were being told to believe that these same people were villains and spies. It was a blow not only to the doctors, but to the very idea of trust. If you can't trust the doctor to whom you entrust your life, who can you trust? The language of the elite in those months became a complex code. No one said anything directly. Euphemisms and hints were used. Instead of saying, "I don't believe this nonsense," a person might say, "Yes, of course, it's a serious matter. We need to carefully sort it out," as they say, separate the wheat from the chaff. The phrase, "carefully sort it out," was a password for those who had doubts. It meant, let's not rush to conclusions. Maybe it's not that simple. One of the most vivid episodes that stuck in my memory happened during dessert. They served apple strudel, which I had prepared according to a special recipe. The guests had already relaxed a little and had a few drinks. Suddenly, one of them, a rather large official from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, leaned over to his neighbor and said quietly, thinking that no one could hear him. "Lydia Timoshuk has now been nominated for the Order of Lenin for vigilance." There was such undisguised irony and bitterness in his voice that I felt a chill run down my spine. After all, it was Lydia Timoshuk's letter that formally started this whole affair. And everyone understood that she was just a pawn, a tool in someone's hands. The official's neighbor turned pale, nodded quickly, and immediately asked me loudly as I walked past with a coffee pot, "Listen, my dear fellow, what is this delicious cinnamon in the strudel? Ceylon?" He did it so skillfully, so quickly shifting the conversation from a dangerous political topic to a safe culinary one, that I couldn't help but admire his composure. He saved both himself and his careless interlocutor, and I, a simple cook, at that moment became an unwitting accomplice in their little conspiracy of silence. I muttered something about cinnamon, about the recipe, giving them time to recover. That was our unspoken role, to be a screen behind which they could hide from the all-seeing eye of Big Brother. The fear of eavesdropping was total. It penetrated the pores, changed people's behavior. I saw how respectable, powerful men, upon entering the dining room, first scanned the corners of the room, the cornices, the chandelier. They were looking for microphones. It had become a reflex. When talking, they instinctively lowered their voices, leaned towards each other, creating an intimate space where, as they thought, no one else could hear them. Of course, it was an illusion. If someone wanted to listen, they listened. But people clung to this illusion like a drowning man clings to a straw. Sometimes, in order to talk about something really important, two guests would go out into the winter garden on the pretext of smoking. There, in the cold, among the frozen palm trees in tubs, they would walk in circles, smoking cigarettes and uttering short phrases that immediately dissolved in the frosty air. They thought they would not be heard outside. Perhaps that was the case. But the ritual itself, going out into the cold to say a few words of truth or doubt, was a terrible symbol of the era. Even the menu indirectly reflected this fear. At some point, certain Jewish dishes that had previously been served from time to time, such as Vorschmack or Zimes, disappeared from it. No one gave any direct instructions. Our chef, a man who was very sensitive to political trends, simply understood everything himself. Serving Molotov Vorschmack at the height of the fight against the Zionist conspiracy would have been tantamount to political provocation. That's how big politics invaded even our pots and pans. But behind all this pomp and circumstance, behind the fear and officialdom, ordinary human feelings sometimes shone through. I remember once serving a dish to Molotov's wife, Polina Semyonovna Zhemchuzhina. She had recently returned from exile, where she had been sent on charges of having ties to Jewish nationalists. She sat at the table, pale, thin, her eyes dull. That evening, one of the guests brought up the subject of saboteur doctors again. I saw her lips tremble. She didn't say a word, just picked up a glass of water, and her hand shook so badly that the water spilled onto the tablecloth. In that simple movement, in that drop of water on the snow-white cloth, there was more truth about fear and suffering than in all the speeches made at that table. We discussed everything in the kitchen, of course, quietly, in whispers, when we were alone. Our dishwasher, old Semyonich, had a niece who worked as a nurse in the Kremlin hospital. She told him what was really going on there, how the country's best doctors were arrested, how they were taken away at night, how the remaining medics were afraid to approach patients, afraid to make diagnoses, because any mistake could be interpreted as sabotage. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, created a completely different picture from the one painted by official propaganda. We lived in two realities at the same time. In one, we prepared exquisite dishes for the leaders who denounced the enemies of the people from the podium. In the other, we listened with fear to stories about how these enemies were created from innocent people. The culmination of all this came on an evening shortly before Stalin's death. There were few guests. The conversation was sluggish and strained. Suddenly, one of them, already heavily drunk, raised his glass and made a strange toast. "To your health! To our health, comrades, while we are still healthy." His words sounded so desperate, so hopeless, that everyone at the table froze. He was talking about health, but everyone understood that he was talking about life. That today you are sitting at this table, but tomorrow you could find yourself in the basements of the Lubyanka, and none of your fellow diners from yesterday would lift a finger to help you. There was a dead silence. And in that silence, I realized that they were afraid of more than just wiretaps. They were afraid of each other. And then Stalin died, and everything changed in one day. It was as if the lights had suddenly been turned on in a room where everyone was sitting in the dark, afraid to move. People began to blink, squint, and get used to the new reality. At the first dinner at Molotov's house after the funeral, the atmosphere was completely different. People spoke louder, more freely, even laughed. And, of course, the topic of the doctor's case came up again. But now, the tone was different. The same man who, just a month ago, had been shouting about a Zionist conspiracy with foam at the mouth, now said calmly, "Yes, it seems that our comrades from the MGB have gone too far. There were, of course, some shortcomings, but to go so far as to... We'll have to tell Beria to look into it." It was the height of political cynicism. Yesterday's accusers instantly changed their tune, becoming supporters of a thorough investigation. I listened to them and felt sick. I saw how easily they renounced their words of yesterday, how they betrayed what they had forced the whole country to believe just yesterday. A month later, the newspapers wrote that the doctor's case had been fabricated and the doctors were rehabilitated. At Molotov's table, this news was met with a strange, ostentatious relief. People raised their glasses to the restoration of socialist legality, as if they had nothing to do with the lawlessness that had been going on just a few weeks earlier. For me, a man from the kitchen, this was the main lesson. I realized that big politics is not only done in offices, it is also done at the dinner table, in the pauses between courses, in unspoken phrases and cowardly glances. I realized what a person's word is really worth in a world where fear becomes the main argument. Those winter dinners taught me to listen not to what people say, but to what they don't say. For the most important and the most frightening things are always hidden in silence. I was not just a cook. In that system, I was also a taster by necessity. Before a dish was sent to the dining room, it was tasted not only by a toxicologist, but also by myself, and sometimes by the chef. It was not a question of trust in the products, which were already tested down to the molecular level. It was a ritual designed to protect against the most terrible threat: poisoning. But there was another, unspoken reason. If, God forbid, something happened to one of the guests after dinner, we, the kitchen staff, would be the first to take the blame. We would be arrested before the soup had even cooled down. Therefore, every spoonful I brought to my mouth to taste was not just an assessment of salt and pepper, but a small oath of allegiance and, at the same time, a test of my own fate. We ate first so that they could eat in peace. That was the essence of our service. At Molotov's table, there was an invisible hierarchy of fear. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich, as the host, kept to himself. He rarely showed emotion, his face an impenetrable mask. But even through this mask, something alive sometimes broke through. I remember once when one of the guests, talking about the international situation, mentioned Israel. Molotov raised his head sharply from his plate. For a moment, something like pain or anger flashed in his eyes. Everyone immediately fell silent. After all, his wife, Polina Semyonovna, had been arrested precisely for connections with Jewish nationalists, and the very word Israel was almost forbidden in this house. The guest realized his mistake, choked, and began to talk feverishly about something else. This brief moment showed that even the iron-willed People's Commissar had his own sore spots, his own unhealed wounds. And the doctor's case, with its openly anti-Semitic undertones, struck directly at these wounds. As a member of the Politburo, he was obliged to support the party line. But as a man, as a husband, he could not help but experience this tragedy in his own special way. Remembering those dinners, I realized that we, the servants, were a kind of lightning rod for the guests. When the tension in the conversation reached its peak, when a dangerous pause hung in the air, someone would inevitably turn to the waiter with some trivial question. "My dear fellow, would you mind refilling the narзан?" Or, "Tell the chef that the sterlet is excellent today." It was a way to let off steam, shift attention, and give everyone a chance to breathe. We were part of the scenery, living interior objects that could be used to fill awkward silences. We got used to it and played our roles flawlessly. I could discuss the merits of Kakhetian wine with a serious expression for several minutes, knowing that I was actually giving two ministers the opportunity to exchange meaningful glances behind my back. In addition to the fear of eavesdropping, there was another, more subtle fear: the fear of interpretation. Every word could be interpreted in 2 or 3 ways, however you wanted. Therefore, people tried to speak as vaguely as possible, using clichés from the newspaper Pravda. These clichés were a kind of armor. If you repeat the official wording, no one can find fault with you. You were simply conveying the will of the party. But the devil, as always, was in the details. In the intonation, in the pause before a key word, in the way a person pronounced the surname of the latest enemy of the people. You could say, "The despicable spy Vovsi," with ostentatious anger, and it would be interpreted as loyalty. Or you could say the same phrase with a barely noticeable stutter, with slightly more articulation than necessary, and for those in the know, it was a signal. I'm saying what I have to say, but I think something completely different. It was the highest form of Aesopian language spoken by the entire Stalinist elite. One incident in particular stuck in my memory. An old Bolshevik, a hero of the Civil War, covered in medals, was sitting at the table. He was known for his bluntness, which in those days was tantamount to suicide. He sat silently all evening, staring gloomily at his plate. When the conversation turned once again to Dr. Murderers, he suddenly raised his arm, disfigured by shrapnel, tapped his chest near his heart with his finger, and said loudly, so that the whole room could hear, "Professor Kogan brought me back from the dead in 1938, with this very hand." And he fell silent again. Professor Kogan was one of those arrested. Such silence hung in the dining room that it seemed as if the air itself had stopped. No one dared to answer him. He did not argue or object. He simply stated a fact from his biography. But this fact was stronger than all the newspaper articles. It was an act of incredible courage. The next day, I learned that the old Bolshevik had had a heart attack. I don't know if it was related to that dinner, but for some reason, I'm sure it was. He challenged the system, and the system caught up with him. In the kitchen, we lived in our own parallel world. We knew which of the guests suffered from ulcers, which had diabetes, which couldn't eat salt, and which couldn't eat fat. We knew their physiological secrets, which they hid as carefully as their political ones. This information was strictly confidential. Mixing up dietary dishes was a crime. Sometimes our knowledge led to tragicomic situations. I remember how one high-ranking official, who had just passionately denounced killers in white coats, quietly asked the waiter to bring him the blood pressure pills prescribed by his doctor. And this doctor was a student of one of the arrested professors. This dissonance between public statements and real life was widespread. They cursed doctors, but continued to be treated by their students because the instinct for self-preservation was stronger than ideological attitudes. After Stalin's death, what could be called a parade of revelations began. People who yesterday were afraid to utter the word doubt suddenly began to eagerly proclaim that they felt from the very beginning that something was wrong here. It was disgusting, and at the same time, humanly understandable. The fear was gone, and it was necessary to urgently create a new biography for oneself, in which one was not a coward, but a secret fighter against the regime. One of Molotov's former guests, meeting me in the corridor one day, slapped me on the shoulder and said conspiratorially, "Do you remember, Ivan, how we exchanged glances at the table back then? We understood everything, didn't we?" I nodded silently. What could I say to him? That I only remember his sweaty face and trembling hands as he raised a toast to Comrade Stalin's health and the defeat of the enemies of the people. Silence became my profession again. Over the years, I had learned to understand people not by their words, but by their appetite. A person who is in mortal fear cannot eat. The food won't go down. At the height of the doctor's case, the number of uneaten dishes on our kitchen table increased sharply. The almost full plates that returned to the sink were a more accurate barometer of the political atmosphere for us than the Sovinform Bureau reports. Conversely, when the tension eased after the leader's death, the guests' appetites improved dramatically. They ate greedily, with pleasure, as if making up for lost time during months of fear. It was the most honest and visible manifestation of change. People began to live again, rather than just survive. Remembering all this today, I am not trying to judge anyone. I was not in their place. I did not sit at that table as a guest. I stood in the shadows, ladle in hand. But shadows sometimes allow you to see what is hidden from the bright light. I saw not statesmen, but simply people gripped by a sticky, paralyzing fear. A fear that made them betray their friends, renounce their beliefs, and say things they did not believe. And this is perhaps the most important lesson I have learned from my long life in the Kremlin kitchen. The most terrible poison is not arsenic in soup, but fear in the soul. It corrodes slowly, but inevitably, and unlike arsenic, no antidote has yet been invented for it. I have lived a long life, and more often, I find myself remembering not the loud toasts and official speeches, but the quiet whispers at the Kremlin table. Back then, in the winter before Stalin's death, it seemed that people's fates were being decided somewhere far away, in inaccessible offices. But I saw that every word spoken and unspoken, every glance, every cowardly silence, also became part of those decisions. Today, recalling dinners at Molotov's and conversations about the doctor's case, I speak of this not for the sake of sensation, but for the sake of understanding, so that we, as mature adults, can better understand how lies are born, how they enter our homes and our dinner tables, and how important it is to recognize in pompous speeches the very whisper of fear that I once heard.